In this video, we're going to focus on transport throughout vascular plants and see how the different organs that we discussed in the previous video work together to do photosynthesis. So this image is a great summary of what we're going to see in this video. We can see some transport of water and nutrients. We can see some transport of sugars from photosynthesis to parts of the plants as well. And you can see different organs are involved, such as the roots with their root hairs, and you can also see different tissues such as vascular tissues. You can see the phloem over here and the xylem closer to the center, as we discussed in the previous video as well. So this actually summarizes the main point of this video. So remember that the main function of plants, at least in terms of why we like them, is because they do photosynthesis. And they make sugar and oxygen for us. So to do this photosynthesis, they need energy from the sun, they need some carbon dioxide, and they need some water. And so the idea is that the tissues and organs will work together to acquire all of these ingredients so that the plants can do photosynthesis for us. So let's talk about the leaves first. We'll talk about how the leaves can absorb the light. First of all, remember a leaf is flat and wide, has a very large surface area, which is great for light absorption. So it's nice and specialized for that. But then there's also the layers of cells that it has. The palisade layer over here, this layer closer to the top, not the outermost layer, but just below the outermost layer, contains a bunch of elongated cells that are packed closely together, which basically allows for maximum light absorption. Also, they contain chloroplasts to allow for photosynthesis. There's also the sponge, so that just kind of goes to explain why the leaf is so good at absorbing light. And the chloroplast contains pigments called chlorophyll to absorb light. You also have the spongy mesophyll in this area over here. They have some spaces between them, and that allows for more of the gas exchange, for some CO2 in there to come in, and O2 to leave, just like that. So you should know how to label this image. I'm going to state it again. It's super important. This is basically the same image, just in a different perspective. You can see the palisade layer over here. You can see the spongy mesophyll layer over here. And at the bottom, you can see things like the stomata at the bottom layer. So how do the leaves obtain CO2? We've kind of mentioned it in the previous slide, but at the bottom part of the epidermal, at the bottom epidermal area, you have these openings called stomata or stoma singular, and surrounding them are guard cells that regulate whether they're open or closed. The top doesn't really have the stomata. It has a waxy cuticle that prevents dehydration, but the bottom does have stomata in order to allow for gas exchange, so for carbon dioxide to enter, and for CO2 and for oxygen and water to leave the leaf. And so here we just zoomed into the guard cells that flank the opening called the stoma. And so we're also going to take a look at how the guard cells open and close the stomata within leaves. Again, you should know how to label this image. It's super important. So in order to open and close the stomata, the guard cells will actually take in or release water. So when the stomata absorb, when the guard cells, I should say, when the guard cells absorb water, the stomata will be open. When the guard cells release water, the stomata will close. And I'll explain why in the next slide. I need you to get that stomata will usually be closed at night when CO2 is not really needed, because photosynthesis happens in the day. So there's no point in leaving stomata open to lose water for no reason. Stomata will usually open during the day when photosynthesis can happen, because you need the sunlight there. So here you can see why guard cells, or how guard cells open and close with water uptake and release. So to open the stoma over here, what's going to happen is guard cells will take in some potassium ions. They'll take in a bunch of potassium ions, and then water will flow through by osmosis afterwards. And that causes the guard cells to become very firm. We call that turgid, very turgid. And because they're firm and turgid, they kind of push off each other and that little pore stays open. Now, if the opposite happens, where you want to close the stoma, potassium ions leave and water follows by osmosis. And so the guard cells shrivel up and just kind of collapse over each other, and that closes the stoma region. So again, here we can see some other examples of transport happening, and we see our examples of hypertonic and hypotonic, which we discussed in the diversity unit. So there are some factors that determine whether stomata will open or close. We've already discussed a few, but you should know a few others. Temperature, usually if it's very, very hot, stomata will close or at least partially close to prevent water loss because we don't want the plant to dehydrate. If there's a lot of water in the soil, stomata could actually stay open because there's no risk of losing too much water since there's lots of water in the soil anyways. So they can stay open to get carbon dioxide and they don't have to run the risk of dehydrating because there's water in the soil. Time of day, so if there's light, stomata are usually open during the day. And then concentration of CO2 in the leaf. If there's a lot of CO2, what's the point in staying open? The stomata can close because they already have some. If there's not a lot of CO2, then the stomata can open up to get more CO2. So these are different factors that can affect whether stomata are open or closed. So you should know what stomata are. Remember that there's a bit of a trade-off. Stomata are open to let carbon dioxide in and to let water and oxygen out. You want to do as much photosynthesis as possible, but if the stomata are open for too long, then too much water might get out and your plant could dehydrate, which is why the guard cells are good at regulating that opening, that stoma opening. So now we're going to take a look at how we get water to the leaves. So the previous slides were, how do you get sunlight? Leaves absorb it. How do you get carbon dioxide? Well, carbon dioxide enters through the stomata. But now how do we get water? So water needs to travel from the roots, underground, through the stem, up to the leaves, through vascular tissue. And that happens basically through the xylem portion of the vascular tissue. The main mechanism that pushes water up, there's two main parts actually. There's pressure and transpirational pull, transpiration. So we're going to talk about what pressure and transpiration are. But before we do that, we need to talk about osmosis, adhesion, and cohesion. We've already discussed osmosis in some detail. Now we're just going to add the words adhesion and cohesion in there, and then we can understand how water goes from roots up to the leaves. So, like I said, water has to come from the roots, and eventually it makes its way to the leaves, and you can see that over here. There's a connection, the xylem in the vascular bundle found within the leaves. So some terms you need to understand, cohesion and adhesion. Here we have some water molecules. What I want you to notice about the water molecules is that, and there's a bit of chemistry here, so if you don't like chemistry, just understand the basics of what I'm trying to tell you here. You don't have to know much more than this right now. Water molecules are polar molecules. What that means is that the atoms don't share electrons equally. In fact, the oxygen holds the electrons a little bit closer to itself because it's more electronegative. Just means it likes to hold electrons more. So because of that, the oxygen is partially negative. It's not a full negative, like it doesn't take away the electrons from hydrogen, it just holds them more closely. So it's partially negative, and the hydrogen is partially positive. And so that's what is meant by a polar molecule. You have some parts that are a little bit negative and some parts that are a little bit positive. And so if you're still with me so far, you'll understand that when you have opposite charges, so for example, partially negative and partially positive, they will attract each other. So what you see here, this little dashed line, this is called a hydrogen bond, H bond for short. It's an attraction between two different water molecules because of the partially negative oxygen and the partially positive hydrogen. So partially negative oxygen of one water molecule is attracted to the partially positive hydrogen of another water molecule. And so because water is polar, water molecules are attracted to themselves. The fact that water molecules are attracted to themselves, or that the term for that is called cohesion. So the water molecules form a very cohesive group. That's called cohesion. It's when water molecules stick together with hydrogen bonding, and the reason they do that is because they're polar. And so we'll see why that's important in a bit. But that is important for transport of water, and we'll see that soon. So here we can see a really cool effect of cohesion. You can see an insect walking on water. The insect is not breaking through the surface of the water because the water has a very, very strong surface tension. Basically, it means it's very hard to break that surface. And that's because of cohesion. The water molecules are kind of sticking together due to this hydrogen bond caused by the polarity of the molecule. Another type of attractive force water will experience is something called adhesion. This will also come into play for the transport of water from roots up to the leaves. So adhesion is water's attracted to stuff, but not water, but to other things. So adhesion is when water sticks to other stuff. So for example, here you can see water on a straw. If you examine a straw carefully when you place it in water or in some water-based drink, you'll notice that it forms this little curve here. And that's because the water is actually attracted to the plastic of the straw over here. So you can see that over here. And so this is called adhesion. Adhesion. That curvature is called a meniscus. It's called a meniscus. So cohesion is when water loves itself, sticks to itself. Adhesion is when water sticks to other things. And it's also sticking to other things because of its polarity. So adhesion is due to polarity as well, with similar bonds to the hydrogen bond. And then the other term you have to know is osmosis. So we already know this, but osmosis is just the movement of water across a membrane, or in other words, the diffusion of water across a membrane, a cell membrane. So here you can see water moving from this side to this side over here to even it out. Now remember that for osmosis to work, there has to be a difference in usually during osmosis, there's a difference in solute concentration on one side compared to the other. So for example, we have two solutions here. We have a salt solution on this side where there's a high solute concentration, and on this side on the left you have a low solute concentration. So water will flow from where there's less solute to where there's more solute. So this is the direction of osmosis in this case. Remember, solutes or salt sucks. Solutes can be sugar, salt, and they suck. So let's take a look at, now that we know all those terms, let's put them into practice to see how water goes from the roots to the leaves. So the first step is that the roots will do some active transport. They'll use energy to pump a bunch of solutes into the leaves. And when they do that, water will then flow in through osmosis because water follows the solutes that are in there. And the solutes are usually ions and salts and other nutrients as well. So water goes into the roots that way through osmosis. Now because there's so much water that enters the roots through this process, there's a lot of pressure that builds up, and that pushes the water up a little bit, up the stem there. It's almost like if you were to squeeze your water bottle, the water level rises because of the pressure that you're applying. But that's not enough to make it reach the leaves. If it was only that, you'd need a lot more pressure for that to happen. So there's another process involved in this called transpiration. That will involve the cohesion and adhesion that we saw earlier. So transpiration is basically the way the water makes its way up to the leaves. What happens is you have some water in the leaves, and that water is going to leave through some evaporation. Now when this water leaves, remember it's attached to another water molecule with hydrogen bonding due to cohesion. And so it's going to pull that water molecule along with it. And this one is going to pull another water molecule along with it. And that's going to continue happening. And basically, as the water leaves the leaf, more water will be pulled up to the leaf to be used in photosynthesis. And so that's transpiration. You have evaporation of water leaving the leaf. And because the water molecules stick together, they will pull other water molecules up towards the leaf for use in photosynthesis. So for this to happen, the stomata have to be open. You can kind of think of this like monkeys in a barrel. There was this game we used to play when we were younger called Monkeys in a Barrel. You had these little monkey creatures, and they would connect arms, and you can pull them out of a barrel, and they would all come out together. Oh, that's a bad arm. They would all come out together because they would all link at the arm. So I like to think of this process almost like monkeys in a barrel, pulling on one water molecule and bringing some more up into the leaf. So that's the process involved to get water from the, those are the processes involved to get water from the soil into the roots up to the leaves. There's a little bit of pressure root pressure that's applied, but that's not enough. You also need that transpiration to occur to pull the water the rest of the way. And in this diagram, I did something wrong. I shouldn't have done it this way. You'll notice that I made the water leave the top of the leaf. Why is that a problem? Hopefully you pause the video and you tried to answer it. That's right. Stomata are at the bottom of the leaf, so they should have actually been leaving the bottom of the leaf. So make sure you review that to make sure you understand that that water leaves the bottom of the leaf where the stomata are found. So the next few slides are just an in-depth analysis of what we just explained. So again, the root hairs will absorb ions to bring some water in, and then the water will basically enter the root, create a lot of pressure, and then that will cause the water to rise a little bit, but not enough to reach the leaves. So we then need to do our transpiration to allow water to go all the way up to the leaves. And water is traveling through the xylem when this is happening. So remember, xylem is for water transport. So that our transpiration process is really where the sun causes the water to evaporate and leave through the stomata. When the water exits, it pulls on other water molecules and drags the ones below upwards. And the two forces that are involved here, the two terms that we learned earlier, cohesion, well, the water molecules stick together so they can drag others up with them, and adhesion. The fact that water can stick to the xylem walls will prevent the water molecules from going back down to the roots. So adhesion is also important in this process as well. Cohesion, water molecules stick together. Adhesion, water molecules stick to other things, in this case the walls of the xylem, so they don't fall back down. And so you can see that whole process happening in these little figures here. Here you can see the water coming out of the stomata. Here you can see that pulling on other water from lower to drag the water back up. So this is just a summary of the processes that we saw, specifically transpiration. And here we have an animation of the water leaving the stomata on the underside of the leaf, and hydrogen bonds dragging more water molecules up as the water leaves the leaves. So you should be able to do questions like this now. If stomata are closed, transpiration cannot happen or will slow down. So in which of the diagrams below will leaves exert a stronger pull on water from the roots? Explain your answer. So read this carefully, try it out. This is a summary of everything we've seen so far. We saw the ingredients for photosynthesis, how they're collected. So CO2 enters through the stomata, water collected by the roots and rise up via the xylem cells. We saw light collected by the leaves because they're nice and flat and they have tightly packed areas of cells that have chloroplasts with chlorophyll pigment in them. And once you have all these ingredients, you can have your photosynthesis that happens, and your glucose is produced and your oxygen is produced. Oxygen can exit and leave the plant to go to other areas in the atmosphere through the stomata. Now the glucose, well, we can get it by eating the plant, but don't forget the plant also needs some of its own glucose, right? It's kind of like if you cook a meal, you're not just going to give that meal away. You want to use some of it for yourself too. So we're going to take a look at how the glucose is transported to other parts of the plant. So just a little reminder, photosynthesis happens within the chloroplasts. You don't really need to know how to label this chloroplast. You need to know it is a chloroplast, but I don't really care that you know. I don't really care so much about what all these other parts are right now. That you'll do in grade 12 biology. Remember to label this because it's a very important structure. So the process to transport sugars from the leaf where it's made to other parts of the plant is called translocation. So once the leaf makes sugars via photosynthesis, the leaf will then transport those sugars to other parts of the plant, and that will happen through the phloem. So here you can see the cells within the leaf with the chloroplasts. They make sugar. The sugar will go into the phloem, and then the phloem can deliver that sugar into other cells. So the cells that contained the sugar, that produced it and that had it initially, they're called the source cells. So for example, it's the leaf in this case. The next part is the sugar will go into the phloem, and then after the phloem, the sugar will travel to the sink cell. And the sink cell is basically just the area where the sugar is stored or needed for some purpose. So if you look in angiosperm, they usually have companion cells that are involved in this process. So before the sugar goes into the phloem, the sugar goes into the companion cell, and then from the companion cell into the phloem, and then from the phloem into the companion cell there, and then into the sink cell. In gymnosperm, there's no companion cell. It's just a direct transport from the source cell to the phloem, and then from the phloem to the sink cell. If you want to know why transport of sugars occurs relatively quickly, you can take a look in your textbook. There's a great explanation about something called sugar pressure. You can read up on that if you want to know some more details. You should read up on a brief explanation of why source and sink cells might change, especially in locations where there's 4 seasons, such as Canada, so you should know that. Take a look at why sometimes sink cells might be at the top and source cells at the bottom, and then when seasons change, you might have source cells at the top and sink cells at the bottom. Think about it first, and then if you're not too sure, go and read up on that, come up with a brief explanation for it, just a brief summary to add to your study notes. So this is just a summary of the process of photosynthesis. We can see that photosynthesis and cellular respiration work together. So we have light energy from the sun. We can't use that directly as animals, so it has to be converted into energy that we can use. And so the plants do photosynthesis to convert that solar energy into chemical energy, which is found in your food and your sugars. And then what we can do is we can eat those sugars, bring them to the mitochondrion to break those sugars open, and then that releases energy that we can use. So remember that we are heterotrophs. We cannot produce our own sugars. We have to go eat to get our sugars. We can only do cellular respiration. We can't do photosynthesis. Plants can do both. Plants can do cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So they're autotrophs. They make their own sugars. They don't have to go eat other plants to get them. And then they break their own sugars open after. So they make a meal, they convert the solar energy into chemical energy within the chloroplast, and then they send their sugars to other parts of the plants, and other parts of the plants may use that sugar using cellular respiration. So the main difference is that the plant makes its own sugars, and the animals, we don't have these chloroplasts, so we have to go hunt for our sugars. There's a little animation online that goes over the connectedness between photosynthesis and cellular respiration, other complementary processes. It's a Pokemon animation, so you can go watch that if you need some more examples and visuals to see how these processes work together. So the idea that cellular respiration and photosynthesis are complementary, that just means that they work together. So whatever photosynthesis makes, glucose and oxygen, so the products of photosynthesis, they are the reactants in cellular respiration. And the products in cellular respiration, well, they are the reactants in photosynthesis. So it's almost like they're the reverse of each other. If you look at their equations, they look like they're backwards. They're the exact opposites of each other. But when you study this in grade 12, you'll actually see that there's a lot more differences between photosynthesis and cellular respiration, especially at the enzyme level and the molecular level. So after watching this PowerPoint, you should have a big idea. You should understand the big ideas of how plants get all the ingredients they need to do photosynthesis in the leaves, how they transport things like water or sugars from one part of the plant to the other, with a focus on the tissues and the organs involved. You should also practice labeling the different figures you saw in this PowerPoint, and there's some practice labeling worksheets that you can use. They're online. And then if you need some more details, you can go read the sections, page 564 to 572 in your textbook. There's also another great plant video that you can watch at this link over here if you need some more visuals and some more explanations.